California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Government support of private discrimination. In the Civil War, Congress created programs to benefit African Americans and passed statutes to protect their rights, but fierce opposition from white government officials undermined these programs and led to their premature end, while the Supreme Court undermined statutory protections. State and local legislatures to impose segregation. American history, and as discussed in the preceding chapters, local and state governments with the tacit approval of the federal government passed. Restricting black conduct. The Black Codes and Jim Crow laws aimed to consolidate and maintain economic and political power generally in the hands of white Americans by controlling the type of work available to African Americans. Work has been performed. 30. This governmental discrimination against African Americans supported private employment discrimination until the Great Migration. As discussed in Chapter 1 and 5, the majority of African Americans lived South, and the majority of Southern black families did not own land and were exploited by white landowners in the sharecropping system. 31. Black women were mostly relegated to domestic service jobs until well into the 20th century. 32. Federal government aimed to improve labor conditions in the 1930s with the New Deal. Federal policies and programs often failed to benefit, or even harmed African Americans, often by design. New Deal programs purposefully linked benefits like health care, paid vacations, pensions, tuition benefits, Social Security, and unemployment benefits to employment with large corporations, which at the time did not hire black workers. 33. Southern members of the House and Senate from states that passed laws to prevent black workers from voting were instrumental in structuring the New Deal to exclude industries in which most black workers were employed, like agriculture, domestic services, and casual labor. 34. Federal government tried to remedy the racism faced by black workers. The actions often lacked power to enact real change and often lasted only a short time. Freedmen's Bureau, short-lived paternalism. Of the Civil War, the federal government created programs to aid African Americans and statutes to protect their rights. However, both failed to live up to their promise to give African Americans equal access to economic and labor opportunities or remedy the harms of slavery. Immediately before the end of the Civil War, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and abandoned lands to provide for the welfare of formerly enslaved African Americans, including through issues of provisions, clothing, and fuel. Necessary for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children, according to the Statute 35. Known as the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency had the authority to supervise labor relations in the South, with the mandate to provide education, medical care, and legal protections for formerly enslaved African Americans. The authority to rent out and eventually sell allotments of abandoned or confiscated land to free African Americans. 36. The original goal of the Freedmen's Bureau Act was the more radical notion of allowing African Americans the means to become self-sufficient. 37. In the closing days of the Civil War, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, setting aside 400 acres of confiscated land for those who had been freed, and 2 months later, the Freedmen Bureaus Act formalized the field order. That each Negro might have 40 acres at a low price on long credit. 38. Many free African Americans and Northern Republicans believed that land reform in the South, granting formerly enslaved African Americans access to their own land, was the true way that formerly enslaved people would be free from Flavors 39. The resulting independent black farmers would provide a power base for a new social and political order in the post-war South. 40. Vision of social relations in the South was opposed by Southerners as well as Northerners who opposed enslavement but whose commitment was more to notions of free labor and capitalism than racial equality. 41. A large number of black landowners. Plantations and disrupt the Southern economy and social system. 42. White capitalists in the North and South believed that black freedom should mean black workers continuing to work on a plantation who would now be paid. 43. They did not believe that African Americans should be able to support themselves through subsistence farming, which would have led to less cotton being grown and posed a threat to the interests of cotton merchants and other capitalists in the South, elsewhere in the United States, and in Europe. 44. After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, to give freed persons an interest in the soil. 45. Andrew Johnson became president and repudiated Lincoln's promises. 46. Proclaimed Johnson, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, government for white men." 47. In less than a full harvest season, the land that Sherman had given to freed persons was returned to the prior owners. 48. Though the Freedmen's Bureau tried to assert and protect the rights of the formerly enslaved, the Bureau under President Johnson perpetuated racist stereotypes, paternalistic attitudes, continued to limit African Americans' economic and social power. Bureau agents often viewed formerly enslaved African Americans as children, unprepared for freedom, and needing to be taught the importance of work and wages. 49. The Freedmen's Bureau abandoned the possibility of land reform in the South on labor relations between black and white Southerners instead. 50. Bureau agents did protect black workers' rights by invalidating enslavement-like labor contracts, and they enforced contracts and settled wage disputes at the end of the harvest season. 51. However, Bureau also harmed African Americans by acting on the racist belief that African Americans avoided work, and it was the Bureau's responsibility to reform such laziness. 52. One commander noted that emancipation only meant liberty to work or starve. 53. General O. O. Howard of the Freedmen's Bureau stated that African Americans must enter into labor contracts regardless of the contract terms because any black man who can work has no right to support by the government. 54. To this end, agents withheld social services and food in order to force African Americans into labor contracts. 55. Prosecuted black workers who broke labor contracts, enforced vagrancy laws, imposed other restrictions on African Americans' mobility. 56. The Bureau allowed plantation owners to deduct unfairly large sums for supplies and rations. Many workers would receive little wages at all. 57. The wage guidelines for black workers provided less pay for black women regardless of their productive capacity. 58. Nonetheless, the Freedmen's Bureau met severe resistance from Southern politicians. In 1866, President Andrew Johnson vetoed the bill extending its existence past 1 year, and it was only enacted once Congress overrode the veto. 59. 6 years later, in 1872, Congress bowed to pressure from white Southerners and dismantled the Bureau. 60. Freedmen's Bureau withheld services and food in order to force African Americans into labor contracts, prosecuted black workers, and enforced vagrancy laws to prevent African Americans from moving. Codes and other laws controlled black workers. After the Civil War, black codes, passed by state and local governments in both the North and the South, governed the conduct of free African Americans. Free African Americans posed a threat to the racial hierarchy of slavery. Codes were a range of laws to maintain the lower status of African Americans through restrictions on movement and activity, often in order to compel them to work in menial jobs for low pay. 61. 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed the institution of slavery, but it allowed involuntary servitude as a punishment for a crime. Mostly Southern state and local governments used this loophole to develop a system of laws, often built around vagrancy laws. African Americans into criminals, and then allowed the government to turn those labeled criminals into de facto enslaved persons, forced to labor without pay or freedom of movement. 62. For an in-depth discussion of convict leasing, please see Chapter 11. Vagrancy laws, passed by numerous states, criminalized unemployment. 63. In 1865, Mississippi law required African Americans to enter into a labor contract with white farmers by January 1st of every year or risk being in violation. 64. Violating such laws risked a criminal conviction that allowed the state or locality to force African American to work without pay. 65. Means of compelling the labor of African Americans persisted even after some forced labor provisions were repealed. Other states used open-ended fraud and false pretenses laws to punish workers who had received advances and then breached contracts without repayment. 66. Jurisdictions used black codes to limit opportunities available to African Americans. Some laws prohibited employers from hiring workers who were already under contract. Contract labor law gave employers nearly unlimited power over workers and often their family members as well. Individuals who quit jobs could be arrested and returned to their employers. 67. South Carolina enacted a statute in 1869 that criminalized simple breaches of labor contracts. 68. Probate courts could order that black children be apprenticed to their former enslavers. 69. For an in-depth discussion of apprenticeship, see Chapter 8. In South Carolina, African Americans were required to apply for a permit to do work that was not agriculture. 70. These codes often reinforced enslavement, even after it had been outlawed. As the Great Migration began, states also enacted laws that discouraged African Americans from migrating to places elsewhere in the country that offered better work opportunities with improved conditions and higher pay. After the Civil War, interstate labor recruiters known as emigrant agents helped black workers leave the South towards better jobs in the North. 71. The Southern states lost large numbers of workers, and even when workers did not move, the ability of leaving improved black workers' bargaining power. 72. The Southern states responded by passing laws that required emigrant agents to pay high license taxes. 73. The Supreme Court in 1900 ruled that one such law was constitutional. Southern states to hinder the ability of poor and rural black laborers to move towards better jobs elsewhere. 74. Supreme Court announces, separate but equal. 66. Congress overrode President Johnson's veto to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first federal legislation banning discrimination on the basis of race. 75 is discussed in other chapters. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was aimed at ensuring that African Americans had the same legal rights as white Americans. However, while criminalizing violations committed under color of law, the act did not provide any civil remedy. 76. The Act of 1875 allowed individuals to pursue a monetary penalty against businesses and other public accommodations that discriminated against African Americans. 77. This protection lasted only 8 years, however, before the Supreme Court in 1883 decided in the civil rights cases that the 14th Amendment did not apply to private parties. 78. 65. Mississippi law required African Americans to enter into a labor contract with white employers by January 1st of every year or risk being in violation. The punishment for violation was a criminal conviction, allowing the state or locality to force the African American to work without pay. Allowed private employers and other businesses to discriminate openly against African Americans with no repercussions. 79. Together with Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which condoned the doctrine of separate but equal. Court's decisions created the ability for both private and public employers to entrench an inferior labor market for black workers, with lower wages, fewer protections, and limited opportunities for advancement for the next 100 years. government protection from violence. North and the South, federal, state, and local governments neglected their duty to protect black workers from violence as a tactic to limit their job opportunities. White landowners, employers, vigilante groups, and others used violence and terror, more closely examined in Chapter 3. African Americans from earning fair wages for their labor and achieving economic success. 80 For decades following emancipation, lynchings. Targeted African Americans who attempted to wield some political and economic influence or even take steps as limited as demanding pay for their work. 81 While private actors often were the perpetrators of these brutal killings, federal, state, and local governments, in failing to prosecute racial violence, its use to limit economic and political opportunities of African Americans. 82.